All right, welcome back everybody to another edition of Bear's Guide 205. Today we are going to look at the Unit 4 review, focusing on the chapters about ethnicity and political geography. Definitely one of the best units in AP Human Geography, where stuff really starts coming together. Now, because of how the AP exam is changing this year, I am very likely we're going to see stuff from this unit because it is the most complex unit. It's one that pulls in information from all the previous units. It connects us to the other units. So very important that you understand this. As always, it's probably going to be a little bit longer of a video. So if you break it up, you want to take breaks, I highly encourage it. All right, starting with Chapter 7, we're just going to jump right into it. The first thing that we talked about with ethnicity is what the heck is ethnicity, right? And we talked about the three things: race, ethnicity, and nationality. Now, race, I wouldn't really worry too much about it. It's just the physical skin color differences between people. But what's important to understand is ethnicity versus nationality. So ethnicity is your cultural allegiance to a group. It's where your family is from. It's where you get your religion, your customs, your language, the food you eat. Example, Hispanic. Where nationality is your legal allegiance to a state. This is based on citizenship. This is based on what your ID says or where you vote. Now, these ideas will become a little more connected as we continue on. Now, you have to know the distribution of ethnicities inside of the United States and where they come from. We know that African Americans primarily are in the southeast United States as a relic of slavery, and then later, after the Civil War, being freed, going up into the northern areas, and then in those urban areas being trapped there because of white flight and stuff like that. Hispanic Americans are in the southwest and south part of the United States due to migration from Latin America. The American Indians are out in the northwest area, and that's primarily because of all the terrible things the U.S. has done in the past to the Native Americans, pushing them out. And then, of course, Asian Americans are primarily in the West Coast because that is the closest area to Asia, and that makes sense for migration. And if you were confused on any of that, that's just what's here. But what's unique is that ethnicities concentrate themselves in the cities, because we know when people migrate, they generally migrate to areas that are going to have economic opportunity, especially when going to a new country. So we know that ethnicities are going to concentrate themselves in the cities, but inside those cities, they're going to concentrate into specific areas. And this is where we get ethnic enclaves. These are places with high concentrations of a specific ethnicity. Because remember, when you move to a new place, you want to be around people that look like you and talk like you and practice the same religion as you and have the same morals, ethics, and values. And this is also a result of chain migration. The fact that you know some people are already there and they're like you, so you're going to move there too. Which then takes us to types of states, because when you have states with different ethnicities and nationalities, you get different types of states. Now, the first one would be a multi-ethnic state. These are states that have multiple ethnicities, but they all share the same nationality. The best example of this is the United States. Then you have multinational states, where you have multiple nationalities. These are people that have allegiance to a part of the country. The UK is a really good example to use for a multinational state. Yes, all the people in there are citizens of the United Kingdom, but they will tell you specifically they're from the region of Scotland, Ireland, Wales, or Britain, right? Now, when individual nationalities are ethnicities, because they can be, a nationality can be your ethnicity, but when you have this nationality that is loyal to their sub-state nationality and it's focused on their ethnicity, they may feel the right to self-determination and they want to be on their own, but they can also choose to live mutually with other nationalities. And we'll talk about when they don't want to live with other nationalities. So with multi-ethnic states, the individual ethnicities don't have power in government. In the United States, you don't have like the African American, delegation of Southeast U.S. and Asian American delegation of the West Coast. Like, we don't have that. Everyone's just considered an American and works in Congress, but we value the different ethnic differences we have. Where in a multinational state, the individual ethnicities do have power in government, and that's what makes them a nationality, that they have some level of recognition or autonomy. Now, other notable multinational states, we've talked about every single one of these. Belgium with the Walloons and Flemish. In Spain, you have the Basque, you have the Catalonians that want to break off. In the UK, we know that we have all four that I previously mentioned. Canada has the English-speaking Canadians and the French-speaking Canadians, or the Quebecois. And then in Sudan, you have the split between Northern and South Sudan. And in South Sudan, you even have splits. So you have to remember too, whenever any of these nationalities want to govern themselves more, this is the idea of self-determination. Now let's move on to the idea of a nation state. A nation state is when the political boundaries match the ethnic boundaries. Well, what does that mean? It essentially means that 90% and up of the people inside your country share the same ethnicity. And thus, because that ethnicity has power in government, they have the same nationality, right? Now, throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, a lot of political leaders wanted to grant ethnicity self-determination, this idea that they can go and rule their own sovereign state. And we saw a lot of nation states start to appear. A good example of a nation state is like Germany. Ethnically, the people are German. Nationally, they're German. Just goes hand in hand. You also get multi-state nations. These are people that have a state, but they're spread into another state. The best example of a multi-state nation, and really the only one you should ever bring up, is North and South Korea. The ethnicity is Korean, but the nationality is split between two states. That's why it's called a multi-state nation. And then we have stateless nations. These are separate nationalities. They have self-determination to be on their own, but they do not have their own state. And they're often spread across different states. We have a list of them. I would say that the best ones to ever use, if you ever come up with a stateless nation, are the Kurds in the Middle East. But technically, any nationality that wants to break off from a country is technically a stateless nation. Let's use Quebec, for example. Quebec is part of Canada, and Quebec has a lot of power in Canada. But at the end of the day, they're still part of Canada, right? They don't have their own state. So the people in Quebec that recognize themselves as their own nationality and they have this idea of self-determination, well, then technically they're a stateless nation because they meet all the criteria to be a country except the fact that they don't have their own land. Now, with stateless nations and nationalities in general, they can be given power, autonomy, or semi-autonomy in the region. And we're going to talk more about the different levels of that soon. Here we go. What does autonomy look like? Well, autonomy is freedom from external authority, right? So what does different levels of autonomy look like? Because if you're, and I would even say in this example, fully autonomous is sovereign states. You have complete sovereignty and complete control over your country from external authority. Where autonomous, we're going to look at places like Quebec, Catalonia, Scotland, Basque, the Walloons, the Flemings. They have a government that makes rules for inside of its border. They've been given power over their area. They're a stateless nation. They don't have complete authority over that area because the federal government can come in at any time and tell them what to do. But they still get to hold, they have a lot of power in their region. So much power that they can have referendums if they want to break off and become a state. They generally have a very strong economy, and they have a lot of say in the country. That if they start talking about breaking off, the country's going to go, whoa, 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 pump the brakes there. We don't need you to do that. Whereas a semi-autonomous region, we're talking about the U.S. natives, the Palestinians, the Kurdish, the Tibetans in China. They have government, but it's not enough power to sway the state government. And they don't have enough political power to vote itself into a weak state or into a new state. And they generally have a weak economy if they have any economy at all. And this is where money and political power go hand in hand, because when you have a strong economy that is contributing so much to the country's overall GDP, you get a lot more political power, and you get to call out the government and go, we want more autonomy for this region. We want, A, B, and C. But when you're semi-autonomous and you have a weak economy, you really don't have a lot of power. And then an example of no autonomy would be like the Uyghurs, the Rohingya, or the Jewish people before the state of Israel. The Uyghur and the Rohingya people right now are currently stateless nations with no government. And they do suffer from persecution and no economy at all. And this was how the Jewish people were before the state of Israel. So when you say a stateless nation with no autonomy, these are the examples you want to use. Alright, so we're moving on to centripetal forces now and centrifugal forces. So when we talk about this autonomy, we talk about different nationalities, we talk about multi-ethnic and multinational states. What decides if these countries are going to stay together or break up is the centripetal and centrifugal forces. Now, centripetal ones are ones that pull us together. These are things that unite people in a country and prevent it from breaking apart. And these centripetal forces can be economic, social, political, or environmental, or demographic. Some examples could be shared holidays, national symbols, a shared religion, a shared language. It can also be government infrastructure. It could be if you have a shared enemy. That it unites you together, or if your geography is conducive to bringing people together. Like if you're a small island nation, there's really not a lot of space in between you and other people, so you feel like you're all in it together. Whereas centrifugal forces are ones that force us apart. Now, the same things that I mentioned as centripetal can also be centrifugal. Religion, language, culture, the economy. All these are just topics. It just depends what the state is. Because if you have one religion and one language, that may bring people together. Whereas if you have a lot of different religions or languages, that could split people apart. Ethnic conflict, regional separatism, if you have one part of your country that is developing much faster than the other, that could create centrifugal forces. If the geography of your state, say it's a huge country, or if it's fragmented into multiple islands, that could cause centrifugal forces. Or it could be, the whole core-periphery thing, or the idea of federalism. If you have one part of your country doing very well while the other one suffers, it's going to force you apart. Remember at the end of the day that centripetal and centrifugal forces are easy. Centripetal forces are things that bring us together. They can lead to ethno-nationalism, more equitable infrastructure development, and increased cultural cohesion. Basically everybody on the same page. While centrifugal forces can lead to failed states, uneven development, stateless nations, and ethnic nationalist movements, which then eventually could result in war or violence and breaking up and making a new country. Every country has centripetal and centrifugal forces, and every country's goal is to increase the amount of centripetal forces they have and decrease the amount of centrifugal forces they have. Now, when we talk about colonialism in the ethnicity chapter, because this, at first you wonder why we talked about colonialism, but this definitely plays a role into how states form and how they stay together after colonialism. So colonialism is when an area's internal or external affairs are completely controlled by another state that area is sparsely inhabited. So this colony has very little autonomy. And colonialism, and we can say imperialism too, has had a lasting impact on development of economies of those colonies. We also know the impact of colonialism created this thing called the North-South divide, where we have the developed countries in the north and the developing countries in the south, or at least the southern hemisphere. And the southern hemisphere countries predominantly were ones that were colonized, while the northern ones were the colonizers. And this is also called the Brandt line, which then leads us to the core-periphery relationship. It's this idea, this theory, that the world is split between the economic core and the economic periphery. The core are the developed countries. They're the ones with all the money, and they dictate how other countries essentially develop, while you have semi-periphery countries in those high developing stages and the periphery countries in the developing stages. And if we look in the world, it's pretty easy to see what countries are part of the core, what countries are semi-periphery, and what ones are periphery. And by this point now, you should really be able to recognize these pretty quickly. And they also follow that idea of the Brandt line. And remember how this works, this theory, is that the core is making money off the semi-periphery and the periphery, while the periphery is providing low-wage labor and raw materials to the semi-periphery countries and core countries, and the semi-periphery is kind of stuck in between. They're making stuff and selling to the core, but they're also selling stuff to the periphery. Now, this whole theory is based on Wallerstein's world systems theory. It's the same thing we've talked about, but this is just the idea that it has hindered old colonized countries from being part of the semi-periphery or the core. So we can also look at the core periphery within a developing country. And I say within a developing country specifically because you're not going to see a core periphery relationship in a core country, because it's assumed that core countries are developed, whereas developing countries are definitely going to have a core area where they have a lot of money and a peripheral area where they don't have a lot of money. So core periphery relationships in LDCs only exist as a relic of colonialism, because colonialism was all about using colonies' natural resources. And to do that, you would have to have, infrastructure set up on coastal regions to harvest these raw materials in the interior parts of the country and ship them out on boats throughout the sea. So as soon as you're not a colony, you're doing the same thing. And lo and behold, that's where all the development is along the coast, where you used to export stuff to your colonizer. Where the place that isn't developed, the periphery, is the inland areas where you would grow the raw materials to send to the docks, to send to your colonizer. And we can see this with Brazil. If we look at the HDI, the Human Development Index of Brazil, we see that coastal areas have more developed areas than the interior parts of it. And this is where you have huge amounts of people living and working and, as a relic of colonialism. And notice the low development area in the periphery and the high development area on the coast. Okay, so what is the economic impact of colonialism? Well, the European powers took colonies to get at their resources. And as I mentioned earlier, that was the whole main idea, is that they just want to harvest all the resources that they can, these raw materials. But after they're no longer colonies, and now these countries are trying to establish themselves in global trade, they really can't develop because they don't have the infrastructure in place to take those raw materials and turn them into finished goods. So this prevents colonies from developing because they're stuck just exporting things to their old colonizer to at least stay somewhat afloat. Developmentally, the colonial power only wanted resources, so the only part of the colony that was developed were the coastal parts, which is now the core area of those countries, while the interior they really didn't care about. And this takes me back to the migration unit that we talked about, how a lot of people in LDCs are moving to the cities because that's where all the infrastructure was. They have this rural to urban migration, and these large cities and LDC coasts are export oriented with jobs and possibilities and opportunities, so people are going to move to that. And they're able to get closer and closer to that because there's transportation networks set up and there is development along the coast. And here's a picture of Rio de Janeiro. And unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to get into this content, especially when we had all the tools in place to understand it. But when we have this rural to urban migration, we're creating these primate cities along the coast where all possibility of jobs and opportunities is located, but it's creating this overpopulated megacity where you have all of these makeshift housing that you see at the bottom of the picture, and they're all flooding Rio de Janeiro to get these jobs. So when we talk about this core periphery, you want to develop the interior, yes, for the people in the interior, but you want to spread your population out evenly across the state. You don't want everyone packed into one city, because if that happens, something happens to that city, then it could be disastrous to the country. So after World War II in the 50s and 60s, many countries had to give up their colonies. So now they have, sovereignty and they can create their own states. But it left all of these old colonies in absolute turmoil, because when the colonizers left, it wasn't like, okay, let's put a system of government in place. All right, everyone's good, cool, now we can leave. It was more like, hey, yo, we out, we're dipping, bye. And that just left so many places in turmoil, and there's no better example than this than Africa. If you look at Africa, all the borders that were drawn were just absolutely placed down, ignored ethnic lines, and we're going to talk about what these borders are in the upcoming slides. But the fact is that these European colonizers cut up Africa for themselves and what they thought was theirs, and when they left, they had these borders still in place, which placed ethnic groups together that shouldn't have been placed together, that may have hated each other for a long time, or ethnic groups were split from the majority of their other people in the same ethnic group, and now they don't get their own state. It was all very confusing and resulted in a lot of chaos that definitely hindered Africa even to today. So moving on to chapter 8 and all the stuff in here, let's continue with types of boundaries, especially because we just started talking about Africa. So types of boundaries and the breakdown. I really like this flowchart because it helps it make sense. So we have two main types of boundaries, physical ones and cultural ones. And relic, there's three, and relic. But what you need to know how to break down are the cultural ones. So cultural we can break into two types, ethnic and geometric. So we base our cultural boundaries, our made-up lines on the map, based on ethnic differences and math, because math is a reflection of culture. Then ethnicity can be broke down into three types of ethnic boundaries, subsequent, superimposed, and antecedent. So let's go into each one of these. First off, cultural boundaries. This means it's a boundary based off an element of culture. So we can have ethnic boundaries, which divide land based on religion and languages spoken. The first type of ethnic boundary we have is a subsequent boundary, where we take ethnicity into place, or take it into account when we divide a place. We want to divide the people by their ethnicity to lessen the amount of conflict that can happen. Now, this happened in India between Pakistan and India, but unfortunately it did result in violence because people had to migrate from their respective countries into their new countries based on their religion and language. Whereas superimposed boundaries do not take into account the ethnic makeup of a place and just arbitrarily draw the lines and don't care about the different ethnicities of the people, which was done in Africa and also resulted in lots of violence. And then finally, you have an antecedent boundary. These boundaries are drawn before the area is heavily populated. That's that far line on the right where no one's there. The best example of this is the western border between the US and Canada. It is a straight line and no one had populated it yet. Finally, onto our physical boundaries. These are ones that are just based on the environment. Mountains, forests, rivers, stuff like that, they can be a physical boundary. This is not a reflection of culture. This is something on the Earth's surface that we did not create. And then finally, relic boundaries. Relic boundaries are boundaries that no longer exist, but the impact of their existence is still felt today. And the best example of this is the Berlin Wall separating East and West Germany. So this wall was constructed by the USSR, and people could not get from East Germany to West Germany and vice versa. After the wall fell in the 90s, the poorer eastern side is still poor to this day. When we look at unemployment rates of West Germany versus East Germany, we still see a very high amount of unemployment in East Germany because of the years behind the Berlin Wall. And as I said, this is a great example of a relic boundary because we can see the impacts of this today. Now, talking more about borders, we have to talk about the UN Maritime Law of the Sea because the fact is our borders extended to the ocean, and we learned that that causes a lot of conflict. So the UN Maritime Law of the Sea has two main borders. Their first one is 12 nautical miles. 12 nautical miles from the shore contains your country's complete sovereignty. The first 200 miles, after 12 up to 200, you get exclusive economic rights. So you don't have sovereignty over this area, but you get to decide who makes money, how money is made, what do you want to do in that area, whether it be fishing or drilling. And then if there's two countries that are so close where they're inside of the 12 nautical miles or they're inside of 200 nautical miles of each other, the boundary is drawn in the middle between those two countries. To get a better look, we're going to look at this diagram. So on the far left, you see territorial sea, 12 miles from baseline, and then you have the exclusive economic zone up to 200 nautical miles, and then the sea. So as I said, the 12 nautical miles are full sovereignty. Under the contiguous zone, that 12 miles, you have some limited sovereignty with like customs, immigration, and sanitation, but then after that, it's just exclusive economic zone, and then the high seas where it's anybody's game. All right, so let's get to the important stuff here, devolution. So we've talked about ethnicity at this point, nationality, multi-state nations, multi-ethnic nations, all different types of things. We've talked about borders. We've talked about all this build up to the point where we're talking about countries fighting with themselves. So multinational states, which are nations with self-determination, may undergo devolution. And devolution can look like two different things. It can be minor or major devolution. So an example of minor devolution is definitely the UK with Scotland. So you have the UK, which is this governing body, but they're going to give, government power and autonomy to the local regions. They're going to let them control taxes. They're going to let them form their own police force. They're going to let them establish their own forms of education. So they devolved that power to those regions. They gave them that power to get them to buy in to stay. So that is an example of minor devolution. So why would they do that? As always with devolution, you're trying to keep these regions happy to stay part of this multinational state, because at any time if enough people feel that they don't want to be part of the UK anymore, especially Scotland's known for this, they could vote in Scotland and break off. So it's important that the UK devolves enough power to these places that make them want to stay and let them control themselves regionally, but you don't want to devolve too much power to where it makes them go, we could just do this on our own. So multiple notable nation states, once again, got to talk about these because this is where devolution starts, especially when a group of people feel the need or the feeling of self-determination. Because they want to rule themselves. They're considered a stateless nation. They just don't have territory. So devolution could completely lead to a country breaking apart. And some notable devolutions that have created new countries, Yugoslavia first started with devolution before it turned to Balkanization. Czechoslovakia went through devolution. Indonesia went through devolution. The state of India went through devolution. Now, these are examples of major devolution, where we are seeing the original government give not only autonomy to a group of people, they're giving them land. So they are becoming fully autonomous. They are gaining their own sovereignty. They are gaining their own country. They're creating their own nation state, and they no longer have to listen to the original government. And as I mentioned, devolution can be minor or major, but devolution can also be peaceful or violent. When Czechoslovakia broke into two countries, it was peaceful. They voted on it, and everything was fine. When Quebec held a vote if they wanted to break off, there was no violence, it was fine. But in India, after the partition of India between the Muslims and Hindus with Pakistan and India, there was a lot of fighting and a lot of violence. 1 million people died. So all these are examples of devolution, but we can't exclusively say that devolution is peaceful or devolution is always violent. And of course, the goal of major devolution and self-determination is to gain this thing of sovereignty. It's the ability to govern your own country without other countries telling you what to do, and it's very key. Colonies don't have this. Stateless nations don't have this. Autonomous regions in countries don't have this. Sovereignty is the ultimate goal. So what happens when devolution doesn't work? So devolution can be minor, giving a group of people power, or it can turn to them wanting major devolution, wanting their own country. But that might not happen either. So then ethnic problems can become so bad that it turns into Balkanization. Because when the original government still exists, it's devolution. But Balkanization can turn to when ethnic groups can no longer get along, and the country just rips itself apart, and the original government no longer exists. We see a bunch of new countries are formed, and it had to be violent. That is the unique thing about Balkanization, and it's the only time you should be talking about Balkanization, is when there was violence and the original government no longer exists. Okay? So the process of Balkanization is always hostile and violent, while devolution can be violent and it can be peaceful. But at the end of the day, both involve splitting apart too. Because in devolution, you can see a country split off from another one. In Balkanization, you see new countries form. But remember, the difference is that Balkanization, the original government, no longer exists. And the best place to see how devolution turned into Balkanization is the place that Balkanization was named after, in the Balkans with Yugoslavia. So Yugoslavia was a multinational country with 5 different nationalities and many different ethnicities. Once their leader died and communism fell, a lot of the individual nationalities started to feel this idea of self-determination, of this idea of nationalism. They want to be their own country. So at first they started to devolve, but eventually it led to Balkanization. So these nationalities attempted to create nation states for themselves. They had self-determination. The problem is that it didn't stay devolution because certain ethnicities felt they needed to ethnically cleanse other ethnicities to get the land that they felt was theirs. So at first you have Macedonia, Croatia, and Slovenia all leave Yugoslavia, become nation states through devolution, and everything was fine. But not everybody got their own state. So we then see people turn to not only get rid of Yugoslavia, but to get rid of ethnic minorities that could get in the way of them forming what they see as their proper nation state. So Bosnia and Serbia decide to kick out other ethnicities. The Serbian province of Kosovo is 90% Albanian, and Bosnia, which is split between Bosnian Muslims, Serbs, and Croats. Essentially what happens is with Bosnia and Herzegovina, that middle country you see there that has the pink, yellow, and green, Serbia and Croatia decide that they want to get rid of the Bosnian Muslims and split Bosnia. And then Kosovo, the country right below Serbia in the purple, Serbia decides that they want to get rid of the Albanian Muslims there and say it's not their land, and they want to get rid of them so they can create a larger nation state, Serbia. And this is where the ethnic cleansing comes in. So the Bosnians and Serbs turn to ethnic cleansing, and the Muslims in Bosnia and the Albanians in Serbia are forced out of their country. And what's left from this is Balkanization, because you have you check all the boxes for this. You have nationalities that are going through self-determination and want to create their own nation states. You have so many centrifugal forces that are splitting this state apart. You have states breaking off and forming their own nation states. And then you have countries that want to ethnically cleanse other minorities and take control, and essentially the original government of Yugoslavia no longer exists. That's what makes Yugoslavia unique. And if you get a question on the AP exam that says, give an example of devolution, don't write about Yugoslavia. It's complicated. It's messy. Pick any other example that is so much better and so much straightforward and easier to explain. But if they ask about Balkanization on the AP exam, the only thing you should be writing about is Yugoslavia. No ifs, ands, or buts. So finally, we had to look at ethnic conflicts and notable devolutions throughout, this unit, and I just have them listed here. We've talked a lot about these. We've done lessons on these, and instead of me going through each one individually, I'm just going to post or link videos in the description that explain each of these conflicts, and I'll also post the PowerPoints to Edsby that explain these conflicts, so you can go back and just watch those instead of hearing me talk over it. Alright, so now we're going to move on to when countries work together instead of countries breaking apart. So we have this idea of internationalism, where we're going to create international organizations where countries work together to accomplish a goal. Right? And countries all around the world work together all the time in multiple international organizations for different purposes. Some notable international organizations are the United Nations. It's a political international organization meant to keep peace. We have NATO, a military treaty organization. OPEC is about oil, and it's an economic international agreement. And then you have the Arctic Circle, which is a political agreement that handles borders and EEZs and the indigenous peoples of the Arctic Circle. Look, each one of these, you don't have to memorize all of these. I would know each one of them just so you have it in your toolkit for AP writing. If they were to ask you, give us an example of an international organization, you could use one of these to talk about the process or the idea. But sometimes we have to take it a step further than an international organization. Sometimes we have to turn to supranationalism, where we form an organization that is more powerful than the individual states, and they come together for multiple shared goals. And the best example of this, the only one you should ever write about, is the EU. Hands down, the most straightforward and easy supranational organization to understand. And why are they so notable? Well, the first reason, and the main reason, is that all the countries in the EU use the same currency. It established a huge economy. It benefited all the countries greatly. It was just it's an incredible thing where you didn't have to transfer currencies every time you went to a new state. But there are some other benefits to being in the EU. One of the biggest ones is that it eliminated tariffs and creates free trade across the EU. The fact that you can travel country to country without being stopped as long as you're in the EU, and now there aren't taxes when you trade country to country. So now goods and people are moving faster all around Europe. People could go work in other countries, they can move goods throughout countries, they can share ideas throughout countries, and this just propelled EU countries in a global world, in a globalized economy, in a world of globalization, where they could compete with people like China, Russia, and the United States. However, there is a drawback. The EU is an organization that is stronger than the individual member states. And to be part of the EU, you have to let the EU make laws for your country. So effectively, they're giving up some sovereignty to be part of this. And that leads into the whole question, well, are supranational organizations worth it? Finally, we hit the forms of government. Now we're going to talk about government in general. Really easy and straightforward. Countries with unitary government, really their central government has all the power and local governments don't. While federal government systems share power between a central and local government, this is what we use in the United States. And then, you ask the question, well, what kind of states would use unitary? And you would think about, nation states where everyone is the same, or smaller states where they don't have to, make laws for a place that's miles and miles away, that everything is pretty uniform. Whereas a federal government would be really good for large countries, multi-ethnic countries, multinational countries, where they can devolve some of the power to those local governments and let them have some autonomy over their area, especially because the federal government doesn't want to get caught up with the day-to-day in those local places. So, as I mentioned, unitary states are good for smaller nation states, while federal states are good for larger multinational, multi-ethnic states. And now we have to talk about gerrymandering, this random topic that seems to come up every year on the AP exam or in AP. So, gerrymandering and redistricting and all that stuff is very unique to the United States. It's literally the example you have to know. So let's talk about the process of all of this. So in the House of Representatives, you have each state has a number of representatives based off of their population. So every 10 years, we have to get the population of the entire country. Then, once we know how many people are in every state, we adjust the fixed amount of seats in the House of Representatives at 435, I think. So then each state gets its own individual seats, and you can see this on the map below. Like Florida has 27, Texas has 36, California has 53, but states with smaller populations maybe only have one, like North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Alaska, So we split these based on the census. Then, if your state gets more seats or less seats, you have to redraw the districts. Because Florida has 27 representatives, that means we have 27 different areas or districts in Florida where people vote for their respective representative. And when seats change, you have to change those districts, and that's called redistricting. Now, the current government gets to redraw the lines of those districts. And if the current government does it to help themselves, to help their own political party, then that's gerrymandering. They want to stay in power and get more people that think like them in power. Now, gerrymandering is the political redrawing of boundaries to benefit one political party, and there are three forms of gerrymandering: wasted vote, excess vote, or stacked vote. You'll also hear people say wasted vote is cracking and excess vote is packing. We'll talk more about it in the next slide. So what does this look like, types of gerrymandering? So in wasted vote, your opposition supporters are spread across many districts, but they're a minority in every district. Think about the M&M game we played. So you have an example. It says, assume there's 50 voters, 20 supporters of the Republican Party, 30 supporters of the Democrat Party. If the Democrat Party controls the redistricting process, what would it look like? Well, they would take those Republican Party members and split them amongst the different districts to make sure that they never win, right? That's wasting their vote. Those Republican voters can vote all they want, but they will never win because they have been gerrymandered into a district where they can physically never get enough votes. Whereas excess vote is kind of the opposite. You're going to push all the supporters and concentrate them in a few districts, and you're going to let them win those districts. So say you have 5 districts, you're going to let the opposition party win 2 of them so you can win the other 3. And then finally you have stacked vote, where distant areas of like-minded voters are linked through oddly shaped boundaries. So if you have people in the northeast corner of your country, or of the state, and then you have people all the way in like the southern part of the state that think the same exact way, you might draw a district that connects those 2 people, even though that makes no sense because they're so far away from each other. But you want to win as many districts as possible, so you create stacked votes. So that is everything for Unit 4. And remember, you really want to think, how does this connect to all the other units? And I can't reiterate enough how important this unit is. It's one of the most popular asked units on the FRQ. It links to so many things that we have learned. We can literally connect it to every other unit in AP Human Geography. So it's really important that you understand the concepts in this unit, not only how they connect to each other, but how do they branch out to all the other ones. So as always, make sure that you hit that like button and subscribe. Be sure to hit the bell icon so you can get notifications when I make new videos. And as always, this was Bear's Guide to a 5. We'll see you next time.